Casper and the Great Divide. It was the mid-90s. That fall, the air wasn't just cold and dry. It was charged with the silence that precedes a collapse. For a 6-year-old child, life was simple lines of black and white. My mother was white, warm, and reliable. My father was black, but not necessarily evil, just a large shadow that sometimes blocked the light. But the black was getting darker. A few weeks before the Halloween that changed everything, the little kid who unintentionally kept secrets, was the hand that pressed the stop button on my parents' marriage. I discovered another woman in my father's life, and I told my mother. It was a moment of reckless innocence against a costly adult secret. I believed I was doing the right thing, swearing blind allegiance to my mother. To my father, I was no longer his innocent son. I became the witness, or perhaps the little executioner who brought the shame. The house became a hell of whispers and stifled anger. When the separation finally happened, it wasn't an amicable divorce. It was an explosion. My father moved to a new place, a soulless house that reeked of new paint and cold tiles, a temporary home that suited the nature of his new life. That night, my father was scheduled to take me trick-or-treating. It wasn't a warm annual tradition. It was an item on a schedule, an obligation to be fulfilled as part of the divorce papers. I was wearing a Casper, the friendly ghost costume. How ironic. I was a child about to become a ghost in his own life, a transparent person to be overlooked and diminished. The soft white fabric was wrapped around my body, my head covered in a hood resembling the cartoon ghost. But inside, I felt exposed and weak, trembling from the autumn air and the coldness of my relationship with the man who was supposed to protect me. My father was in a state of silent boiling. He said nothing about the divorce, nor did he mention the other woman, but the anger was rising from him like visible steam. He saw my face, not the Casper costume. He saw the face that brought him consequences, the face that ruined his secret. The silence in the small truck was heavier than a 6-year-old could bear. The old truck stopped next to a well-lit house, where children's laughter could be heard. This was the 3rd or 4th stop on the trick-or-treating tour my father was impatiently conducting. I was sitting in the passenger seat, my small hand clutching the candy bag that wasn't yet satisfyingly full. Suddenly, my father reached his hand across my body, his movement sudden and violent. It wasn't like he was reaching for the glove compartment. He reached directly for the passenger door and pressed its latch. A faint click was heard, the sound of the door being released. That moment is etched in my memory not because of the sound, but because of my father's intention. Why did he do that? Why did he unlatch my door instead of his own to get out? In a split second, perhaps it was a child's awareness or a survival instinct that guided me, I felt the danger. Maybe it was just an unconscious physical aversion to his proximity or his silent anger. Instead of getting out of the door that had been unlatched for me, I crawled across the cold leather seat, through the empty space beside my father, who was still seated, and got out from the driver's side. This simple act was a small declaration of independence, a desperate attempt to take initiative in an environment where I was completely powerless. I returned to my seat, my father still silent. We got back into the small truck, and as soon as we took off, my father's behavior turned to pure recklessness. He drove erratically, as if every part of his body was screaming with anger at the world. We merged onto the highway, and I wasn't wearing a seatbelt. A 6-year-old doesn't think about a seatbelt when his father is the driver. The father is the safety system. But in that moment, I was at the mercy of a metal machine driven by an angry man. Drowsiness quickly overcame me, a combination of the candy excitement, the cold, and perhaps the emotional exhaustion made me relax on the seat. With the truck's reckless speed and swaying, my movement became subject to the harsh laws of physics. I remember the sensation of a sudden movement. Maybe my father swerved or changed lanes forcefully. Then I felt dizzy, as if I were swinging in space. There was no belt to stop me. In a fraction of a second, I fell out of the truck. The wind slapped my face. A harsh, terrifying scraping sound was heard, perhaps the sound of my body giving up the Casper costume and grinding against the rough asphalt. The surface was hard, dirty, and mercilessly abrasive. Then there was a horrific blow, a solid, resounding impact on my head. Then, nothing. I returned to life slowly, painfully. I wasn't on the highway. I wasn't in the hospital. I wasn't at home. I woke up on the cold wooden floor of my father's new house, the divorce house. The pain was the first thing I felt. A burning sensation everywhere, as if my skin had been stripped and covered in sand. My skin was raw, covered in abrasions, dried blood, and dirt absorbed from the road. On top of this pain, there was a devastating feeling of dizziness and nausea in my head, unmistakable signs of a concussion. I was lying on my back. I looked up and saw a scene etched in my memory like a distorted, terrifying image. I saw the back of my father's head. He was pacing back and forth in the living room, like a caged ghost. He wasn't leaning over me, he wasn't talking to me, he wasn't holding me. He was watching me, but he wasn't caring for me. That brief moment I regained consciousness before he picked me up was the most freezing moment of all. He saw me. He saw my battered, unconscious body on his living room floor. He knew the extent of the disaster. Yet, there was no cell phone in his hand calling 911. There was no panic of a parent who had almost lost his son. There was only the sound of his quiet, deliberate footsteps and the silence of the room. It was as if I were already dead to him, and he was waiting for the right moment to report the accident. Eventually, my father picked me up. I remember him carrying my limp, pain-covered body back to the small truck, but this time it was different. It was a carry akin to carrying incriminating evidence that needed to be disposed of, not an injured child who needed saving. He didn't go to the hospital. He drove me home. My mother's home, the only real safety I had. My mother remembers the moment she saw me. It was an unforgettable scene of horror. Her little boy covered in what she later described as road rash, a combination of open abrasions, clotted blood, and dirt. My father handed me over to her in a quick, twisted exchange. He downplayed what had happened. He told her it was a minor accident. Maybe I fell while playing, or something like that. In the midst of the divorce chaos and mistrust, my mother believed my father. She didn't take me to the hospital. Her fear and her belief in her ex-husband's lie put me in greater danger. But my father ensured his secret remained safe. My mother, despite her unintentional neglect, took care of me. She cleaned the festering wounds, applied ointment to the road rash, and cared for me as I recovered from the officially undiagnosed concussion. But through it all, the truth of what happened on the highway or the pacing in the dark living room was never spoken of. The event was completely erased from the family's memory. My mother didn't know the truth until many years later, when I was older and asked her for the details of that terrifying night. Today, there is no talk between us. We have cut all ties. This separation is the product not only of the horrific accident, but also of my delayed realization of the malice underlying his behavior. What haunts me most in that flashback is not the physical pain of the fall, but the static image of my father pacing in the living room. He knew I had a concussion. He knew I had fallen from a speeding truck. He knew that every minute that passed without medical intervention increased the chances of my permanent damage or death. Yet, he chose to wait, he chose silence, and he chose to preserve his story rather than save my life. That wasn't just an accident or negligence. It was a moment of conscious decision-making, where my father loaded my unconscious body and carried me to his house, as if he was weighing his options. to let me die quietly and frame the tragedy as an accident, or to face the legal and social consequences of his recklessness and anger. He chose to hide his deed at the expense of his son's life. The weeks that followed the accident were a strange and isolated period of convalescence. My mother, who had swallowed my father's lie to avoid further conflict and the drama of the divorce, was the devoted nurse. I remember the stinging sensation of cleansing the road rash with medical swabs. Every touch on my body ignited a fire. These abrasions were scattered across my arms, knees, and shoulders, as if I had been flayed with gravel. Those marks were silent testimonies to the force of the fall. Initially, my head was constantly spinning. Bright lights caused me pain, and loud noises sent shocks through my skull. This was the officially undiagnosed concussion, a mild traumatic brain injury, TBI, completely ignored by the one who should have been my protector. I was forced to rest in bed, surrounded by Halloween toys I couldn't enjoy. In this isolation, something internal grew. It wasn't just physical healing. It was the infiltration of systemic denial. I had suffered a near-fatal accident, yet no doctor entered my life. The catastrophe was treated as just a big scratch. The silence surrounding the event forced me to doubt myself. Did I overreact? Was I so bad that I deserved this? This shared denial by both parents planted the first seed of distrust in my own perception of reality, a foundation for misguided self and other assessments that would haunt me for years. When I entered adolescence, I began to feel the consequences of the toxic stress exposed to my developing brain. I didn't know it was caused by medical neglect at age 6. I simply thought I was different. The part of the brain responsible for the fight-or-flight mechanism became overdeveloped. I would react quickly and angrily to stress, and bouts of anxiety and hyper-vigilance increased, especially in enclosed spaces or while driving. I felt I had to be on high alert always, as if I were running an emotional emergency room inside my head. The part that controls emotional regulation and risk comprehension was malfunctioning. This created contradictions. I found it difficult to focus on academic success, while at the same time I tended toward reckless behaviors in search of calm or excessive pleasure that could suppress the overactive fight-or-flight center. It wasn't about defiance. It was about a desperate, unhealthy attempt to regulate a nervous system damaged by the trauma of parental neglect. I lived with the symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, C-PTSD, without knowing the cause, where intrusive thoughts, anger, and difficulty trusting others were the shadow that followed me. The original wound, the betrayal at age 6, bled into every new relationship, making intimacy impossible. The truth was buried and covered by layers of parental silence, but it emerged in late adolescence. I asked my mother about the Casper costume and that night, but this time I demanded details, especially why I hadn't gone to the hospital. My mother's eyes widened, and in that moment, the narrative she was used to collapsed. She confessed her guilt and that she believed my father's lies then. But she revealed details I hadn't known. My father's insistence that it was a minor accident, and how he brought me home first. When I asked, "Was I unconscious?" she answered with a tremor, "Yes, you weren't moving. He said he put you straight in the truck." In that moment, the puzzle pieces merged. It wasn't just neglect. The concealment was intentional. The moment I woke up on the floor, seeing the back of my father's head pacing back and forth, wasn't a fever dream. My father was weighing his options. He was trying to get rid of the evidence, establishing a story for himself before facing anyone. My mother indirectly confirmed my worst fears, the malicious indifference toward my life. I didn't confront my father then, as confrontation with him was no longer necessary. He had become a complete stranger, and once I realized he had planned for my death to avoid accountability, there was nothing left to say. "We don't talk to each other anymore," This sentence is not a statement of grief or failure. It is the culmination of a deliberate decision, a final attempt to rebuild self-security. Once the underlying intention of my father behind the event was verified, his intention to abandon me, I realized that his presence represented a continuous psychological threat. Maintaining complete separation from the source of severe betrayal trauma is crucial for recovery. There was no room for healing as long as his toxic and threatening presence loomed. This decision was the healthy boundary that had to be set to protect the damaged nervous system. Healing required years of work to rebuild internal trust, fight intrusive thoughts, and correct the misguided assessments that made me blame myself for years. I reclaimed the power of the Casper costume in a way I hadn't expected. I became a ghost in his life, a person invisible to him, but in reality, I am the one who survived his schemes. I managed to use the irony surrounding the friendly ghost costume as a cognitive means to process the horror. I transformed the horrific story from being merely an accident into a structured narrative that critiques his parental malice. This narrative is now my weapon, and the story is the proof of my survival. And this is my story. Thank you for following, and I hope you will subscribe to the channel to enjoy the stories I will be sharing in the near future.